When a story finally comes to an end, we often reflect on just how different things are from where it all started. We reflect on the key decisions and events that lead us up to the final chapter, the final scene, the final mission. Whatever the medium, a conclusion always calls for reflection. How did the characters that we've been following for so long end up there? Why did they end up there? What string of choices, failures, and successes were directly responsible for leading them up to this point? These are all important evaluations that we make when reflecting on a story that we complete, but for all of these reflections to have a meaning of their own, it's even more important to look deeper into exactly what drives the story itself, or more specifically, who. Because within every episode, every movie, book, and game, are characters that are responsible for how things pan out. And as they cause the story that we follow to change, there's a gradual evolution that occurs within them as well. So when we reflect on everything that's happened after it's all said and done, and we try to pin certain events as the catalyst for the ending, what you find within some characters is a journey just as interesting as the primary story you followed. You identify the catalyst for changes within the individual now. You pinpoint their previously newfound motivations. And when you look back on how much the overarching story has transformed, you can see how much of that is true for the characters that drove it there as well. Obviously, Red Dead 2 sits among many other games that perfectly mirror this focus on character evolution and progression. But an individual whose character is eventually defined by their transformation is Sadie Adler, an innocent and hard-working woman turned to a vengeful and relentless outlaw. Someone who at some points is unrecognizable to the person she once was. Lately. Sadie Adler remains close to her original sense of morality in terms of her honesty and conviction, but her motivations and attitude undergo two transformations throughout the game that at some stages seem to overtake the woman she once was. One that was seemingly unavoidable and one that was ultimately for the better, but both that induce a very noticeable change in who she is and what she does. Not much is known about Sadie's past, only scraps of information that provide a small insight into the life she once led. But these small pieces of information provide enough context to give us a base for her personality and characteristics. She once led a simple but hard-working life alongside her husband Jake. They owned a small home together, and their relationship has been described by Sadie as an equal partnership. They shared and provided for each other. They were an innocent and honest team. But we first meet Sadie in the midst of her entire life being ripped away from her. Her husband has been murdered, her home has been taken over, and a gang known as the O'Driscolls is to blame. But blame, along with the thirst for revenge, would come later. For now, Sadie is presented to us as fragile and afraid, but not helpless. It's immediately evident that Sadie isn't the lay down and die type, even despite her current situation. And this is a trait we come to learn is fixed indefinitely. As Micah torments her during her first appearance, Dutch and Arthur extend a helping hand, and invite her to share shelter with their gang. the first step in a long line of decisions that not only shape who she will become, but will also mold her a newfound purpose. This is the beginning of Sadie Adler's evolution. Both Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 provide us with small shreds of evidence that suggest Sadie is already fed up. She possesses a lot of pent-up anger, and it shows in small encounters around the camp during these two chapters. Already, she seems more consumed by restlessness and, to some extent, rage, as opposed to her original state of mourning. And we find out exactly why, along with a call to solution, in the mission Further Questions of Female Suffrage. This mission is particularly important for Sadie's development because it reveals her desired place in the gang, along with solidifying some of our assumptions regarding her character. After a brief confrontation with the camp cook, Pearson, that involves both a refusal to do any more kitchen work, along with a threat to skin him if he objects, Sadie is confronted by Arthur, who's come to see what the argument is about. Now, this is the most notable time throughout the story so far that Sadie expresses her willingness to play a larger role in the gang. She's disinterested in performing the same tasks as the other women, such as caring for the children, preparing the camp meals, along with other housekeeping-based activities. She explains to Arthur that life with her husband involved shared work. She reveals that she's competent in hunting and doesn't forget to mention that she can use a gun. Sadie's attitude towards the gang has undergone a gradual change already, but under the cover of this is a personal mission that's been brewing since the murder of her husband. By the end of this encounter, after running errands in town with Arthur, we catch a glimpse of a certain recklessness that we eventually see more of further in the story. But this recklessness also provides Sadie with enough to prove her worth as an outlaw to Arthur. When they're approached by a swarm of Lemoyne raiders on the way back to camp, Sadie impulsively opens fire and initiates a shootout. A shootout that both Sadie and Arthur win, but a close enough call for Arthur to call her out on. Despite the obvious risk involved, Arthur is definitely impressed with how she handled herself, and he realized somewhere inside her seemingly newfound confidence was also a wave of determination and anger. On the ride back to camp just prior to the shootout, Sadie mentioned something briefly that Arthur now understood was no bluff. It was her happiness that had been stripped away from her. It was her husband that had been murdered, and no one was going to take anything away from her again. As time passes in the story, we're gradually exposed to the full extent of Sadie's change in direction. So far, we've been given hints and snippets of her somewhat aggressive and explosive personality, but it isn't too long after our first proper look at this that we're introduced to the specifics of her new goals and wishes. An undying thirst for revenge on the ones responsible for turning her life upside down. Revenge becomes the focus of Sadie's character, and although at some points it seems as though Sadie plays it off as a sort of game, hunting down and killing the O'Driscolls becomes an obsession. We begin to see solid examples of her dedication to her new cause in missions like Horseman Apocalypse. When a swarm of O'Driscolls storm the gang's new camp, Sadie can be found fighting her own band of O'Driscolls independently. When Arthur finds her and asks what she's doing, she claims she didn't want to miss any of the action. Obviously, Sadie is fighting in order to protect the gang like everybody else, but the fact that these are O'Driscolls they're fighting puts a notably personal spin on it for her. She might be fighting for the gang in some sense, but in another, this is a fortunate opportunity to take revenge. It's why in this instance in particular, fighting off a bunch of enemies is different. It's personal, and she enjoys it. By this point, Sadie has changed dramatically. She might have had this vicious determination in her all along, but in contrast to the woman that they found in her cabin, terrified not all that long ago, she's almost a completely new person. However, we can't ignore the obvious amplification of her already existing traits that really add fuel to the fire in terms of who she is in her new life. Her current situation allows a lot of these traits to become more apparent as they become more applicable to the problems that arise. For example, Sadie wasn't a murderer at heart, but after the horrible things the O'Driscolls did, she made a choice to seek revenge and therefore developed. But on the other side of this, Sadie has always been a hard worker at heart, and with the dangers and stresses that come with being involved in an outlaw gang, her naturally hardworking attitude is especially obvious. Both of these are transformations to her character, but the difference is that one is learned and one is further embraced as time goes on. It's important to take note of this as Sadie continues her mission of revenge against the O'Driscolls, because a new focus on brutality, despite her justifications for it, are not the only developments we see in her character. We also see her develop as a leader. When Dutch, Arthur, Bill, Micah, and Javier disappear after being shipwrecked, it's later revealed upon their return that Sadie took charge in their absence. She organized the gang's escape from the Pinkertons and relocation of the camp so they could remain hidden. She assumed the leadership position and ensured the safety of the same camp who had taken her in. As I mentioned briefly before, Sadie has never been helpless and she's definitely never been cowardly, but to see the extent of her development in terms of not just her persistence and determination in personal battles, but also her bravery in the face of disaster when protecting the gang, is up until this point unexpected. Her decision to take initiative in such a trying time for the gang really solidifies her loyalty and willingness to protect her new family. But this isn't to ignore the fact that her focus on revenge undoubtedly overpowers this in some cases. This is a much darker side to Sadie's evolution, but her obsession with taking down the O'Driscolls remains at the forefront of her priorities, despite her obvious concern for the gang. Sadie is fueled by the destruction of her once peaceful life, and although she has the capacity to remain level-headed when it matters, she takes on a very Punisher-esque approach to the way she exacts her revenge. This fortunately comes with results, but equally unfortunately comes with a certain blindness due to the personal nature of her goals. She possesses a deep and irreversible hatred for the O'Driscolls in their entirety. It doesn't matter if they played a direct part in her husband's death or not. If they're in allegiance with Colm O'Driscoll's cause, she wants them dead, and she wants them dead by any means necessary, even if it means putting those she cares about in danger. Probably the most extreme example of this is her plan to ensure that Colm O'Driscoll is hung at his next sentencing. Just as a little bit of background information, Colm O'Driscoll is confident he won't be hung as he always has members of his gang attend the hanging to make sure he escapes alive. But Sadie's plan is to stop those members from intervening, therefore allowing Colm to be executed. And it would have been a relatively safe plan if all was to go smoothly. Dutch, Arthur, and Sadie watch him swing and leave. It's as simple as that, in and out. But just as I preface this point with, Sadie's hatred for the O'Driscolls is deep and irreversible. And although Sadie manages to keep her composure in most stressful situations, this personal issue runs too deep. Instead of following the plan and allowing the execution to occur with no issues, she puts a knife to the throat of one of Colm's defenders and kills him. Compromising their secrecy might not have been a part of Sadie's plan to begin with, as she's dragged away screaming and firing haphazardly. But the danger she not only put herself in, but also Dutch and Arthur, is undoubtedly selfish. A prime example of the recklessness I mentioned before that seems to take over whenever the O'Driscolls are involved. The same recklessness that puts others in danger on multiple occasions. And although that isn't Sadie's intention, she can't seem to help herself whenever an opportunity for revenge arises. The obsession by this point is ingrained, it's become a part of who she is. No matter how much it seems to affect her along the way, the hunt won't end until one of two things happens. She dies, or the O'Driscolls become extinct. Amidst the erratic and overwhelming collapse of the gang, Sadie is equally determined to finish what the O'Driscolls started, as she was when she accepted that her husband was gone and was never coming back. The end for the gang draws closer and closer, and Dutch skirts the edges of his own sanity, Micah there, ready to give him the final push. And as Arthur grows sicker and sicker by the day, the foundation of what held them together begins to crumble. It would be unfair and equally untrue to say that Sadie is uncaring of this, as the final stages of the gang's downfall is not only inconvenient for everyone, but it also marks the death of a family who once stood together as a powerful team. And to Sadie specifically, it marks the death of the same family who took her in at her very lowest. But if it's one thing that stands out about Sadie, one thing that is carried over despite her change in personality and evolution as a character, is that desperate times, desperate situations, do not stop her. The missions Miss Sadie Adler Part 1 and Part 2 serve as the conclusion to Sadie's crusade against the O'Driscolls, teaming up with Arthur to finish things once and for all. The pair of them arrive at a camp full of O'Driscolls and make their way through, killing all of them. But Sadie insists that if Arthur sees a specific person, one she describes as a fat, bearded man, that he is to be left to her. And although we haven't been given much background information exactly as to why, we can assume that this personal grievance has a direct connection to the death of her husband. Once all of the O'Driscolls appear to be dead, Arthur finds Sadie attacking the man she spoke of. And this is a scene that opens up another factor of Sadie's development. Telling the man that she said they would meet again, before killing him in a fit of rage, seems to almost put Sadie at ease. As she goes on to talk to Arthur about her husband, it's clear that it was relieving for her to finally have ended things, almost as if the war was finally over and she could rest. This all reaffirms to us just how much the murder of Jake Adler affected her, and how much it will continue to do so. She's completely self-aware of how savage and brutal she's become on her quest for revenge, but I don't think that the self-awareness should be mistaken for guilt. The truth about Sadie's evolution is that it isn't one of steady corruption or degradation of her hardworking and innocent personality, but rather one of sacrifice and obsession that leads to the serving of justice she had hoped for. It was obvious to her that the death of her husband would be just another forgotten murder carried out by a gang without morals and without guilt. It was obvious that if she was to just sit there and wallow in the pain they caused her, that they would never face consequences for ruining her life. Sadie Adler's evolution is the result of someone with an already existing iron will who is pushed to utilize it. She knows that she'll never be able to return to the life she once led, or revert back to the person she once was. But she also knows that becoming a version of herself so unlike the one she used to be was exactly what led her up to this point. It's exactly what was required to shell out the justice that was deserved. In the end, Sadie's decision to take what was left of her life and dedicate it to fighting against the very thing that destroyed it was what forced her to adapt and transform. It's what forced her to embrace and utilize an unbreakable will that would eventually mold her a new life as a bounty hunter. Ensuring justice for her husband took her to a place of merciless obsession that may have tipped her over the edge had her goal never been achieved. But to avenge her husband was to honor who he was and what they had, and ensuring the deaths of those responsible, both directly and indirectly, was a fair enough price to pay.